Welcome back to episode 2 of the SEMA Prep Get This Kyza Stuff Done episode. So from last time we talked about the SEMA Prep, unfortunately we got some not so great news that the car is no longer going to be going to SEMA. I guess some stuff kind of fell through and a few delays. So they are going to be debuting the car around the same time, early November. So we're still going to get these lights done for them. And yeah, we're excited to get these wrapped up. We got some stuff that we've done since last time we talked, and I'm going to show you guys what's up. So a few things that we changed around is the projector. We want the profile LED projector. These have a clear lens as opposed to the MLED, so it matches the HB high beam better. And then also these are both going to be LED, full LED. So this is low beam and high beam. It's like a bi-LED, and this one's just a dedicated high beam LED projector. The brackets we had made, we had Boosted Creations and Palmyra weld these on. So they're very sturdy. It's welded onto the existing metal frame. And I just hit them with a little bit of primer for now, just while we're working on the rest, just so we can kind of see what we're doing a little better and kind of mock it up. But yeah, they look great. The fitment's awesome. We did like a quick rough aim, and everything aims out straight, so very happy about that. We have 2 Diode Dynamics Demon Eyes in here, so those are going to be able to light up the etching that To Offend designed inside there. And at this point, what I'm working on is just the hexagons. We got these back from the CNC. I think Jordan got some better video footage of these, but these are going to house the LEDs strips, and we're just going to wire those in there. It's going to be the top and bottom. We have 2 holes drilled for the top. That's going to attach these to the backing projector brackets, and then the LED is going to light up. And I think for these we're going to do a little sequential, just so we have the option for programming using a ghost sequencer. But yeah, at this point all I'm going to do is just use our 3D printed one. It's kind of junk. It's the same shape and size, and I'm going to use that as almost like a jig, so I can solder these in and make sure they're the exact same fit and distance apart from each other before we drop them in here. After we put those in the backings, I'm probably going to use like a 2-part epoxy with a white tint to kind of fill in, and that'll kind of just hide a lot of like the individual LED dots. The acrylic pieces that go on the top are fully clear, so I just want something to kind of diffuse all this stuff, as well as the screws that hold it into the backing plate. So I mixed them up last night. It looks really good. I think it's going to do the trick just well, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah, just if it's a white, it's gonna like ooze out. It's just like be kind of messy.
It might. I could always like take a cover off of one of these. I have like a little like vent hole at the top. Push it in, like all of it just like I got like extra ooze out of that. Like the path of least resistance. Boom. I can always Dremel a lot underneath here too. Make way for like the, I think it's like the solder and stuff is like holding up a little bit. So I can try to press it back a little more. Epoxy the whole thing, maybe drill like a, like use something as like a little vent hole to push any extra out, and that way I can like really get that cover like on there good. Oh hello. We're back. So we figured out the best way to use the epoxy to try to hide the LEDs. So the big thing that we were like concerned about was obviously when we had the LEDs mounted and half of it, like Live to Offend specified, the top half is just very blank. And then we also had these screws that we use to hold these onto the backings. The LEDs, because they're white and amber, they do have like that yellow and orange tint to them. So it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. So what we ended up doing was we used some epoxy, 2-part epoxy, and then we used some white tint. So it's specifically made for epoxy, and that kind of gave us this diffuser look. Kind of the same stuff that a lot of aftermarket headlights use and even some OEMs. So we were just able to use that to hide some of the LED color, as well as have that whole top just look more uniform. So these I sanded down again, just because there was a little bit of epoxy resin that got on there. So I just have to polish these one more time, but overall they look great. You can still see the LEDs very, very faintly, but I think once they're in the car and more than 2 feet from your eyeballs, they're gonna blend very, very nicely. One of them, the LED boards kind of floated towards the front a little bit. They kind of tipped in. I pulled the wires when it was curing and to try to hold tension on them, but I think what that did was it kind of pulled this one side back, tipping the top of it in a little bit. So you can see the LEDs, like the orange and yellow, a little bit more on those. This is kind of like a first of part, so we do have a better method now with these next ones we're gonna do. I actually went ahead and just JB welded them onto the backing, the black backing plate. So that should hold them flat and they're not gonna tip forward a little bit. It's not very noticeable on these, like it still looks really great, but it's just a lesson learned. And if we do produce these again going forward, they'll be perfect this time. So always good to learn from somewhat mistakes and keep going. So I already soldered and tested the LEDs on these. I kind of made these little holders for us to be able to pour the epoxy where these sit flat. The reason I had to redo it like 2 or 3 times on one side was I would fill it with epoxy and then press this top plate in. And I kind of assumed, I actually drilled like these little relief holes here. I thought that that would help push the epoxy out and get rid of the air bubbles. But the issue we were having was the air bubbles would obviously float to the top, which is the viewable part. What we ended up doing was we filled it with epoxy and then flipped it and smushed it down. And that was able to help any sort of air bubbles there are. It kind of rose to the back of these. And these are gonna be sealed up in a headlight, so we're not worried about waterproofing. It's just more the visual piece of it that we're worried about with air bubbles. So these came out really good. There's no air bubbles. Like I said, we had to do it like 2 or 3 times for one of them just to figure out the best way to do it. So these next ones here, I'm gonna pour the epoxy, just flip them right off the bat because that worked great last time. The other thing we figured out was on these last ones, I glued the wire holes before we filled it, and that way when we fill it with epoxy they wouldn't leak out of the bottom. But because we're gonna tip them anyways, I'm gonna leave those open, and what that should do is allow any sort of excess epoxy, instead of leaking over the top this way, it should leak out the back as well as relieve any air. Headlight farts. So this is kind of a side-by-side comparison of what they would look like if we didn't add the epoxy compared to what they do now. So obviously this is like more black look because the inside's all black, but you can see the screws that hold them on. You can see the individual LEDs as well as the boards and the solder joints. So this way is a little bit more uniform. It should give them a nice connected LED array instead of the dotted look, as well as hide like all the guts. So I think these are gonna look really good. They're gonna pop a lot, especially when the lights are off. But even when they're on, the LEDs will look more uniform.
What does it take to get the perfect mixture?
With this stuff,
Good or
that's
bad?
the hard part. Is like if I could measure like a tiny little bit, it'd be really easy to get it consistent. But
Yep. Play with fire, kids.
that's right, especially between your legs. So I just poured the mix in these small paper cups. These are a lot easier to pour out of. We're gonna kind of canoe it. The plastic really doesn't do that, so that'll help us get a better more precise pour. So once we pour this in, I'm just gonna flame treat it with the torch. That's gonna get rid of any air bubbles at the top. I'm gonna put the clear covers on and then flip them. There will be some excess epoxy. We're kind of ready to catch that. Hopefully it works. Camera guy missed it. We had a small air bubble right where the LEDs are. The tough part with the epoxy is the surface tension of the air on the LEDs. Like the air wants to get trapped in there, like grabs to it. So with the other parts, the air bubbles just rise right up, but the LED board being in the way, like I said, the surface tension of the air on it. So I drilled like a small, I don't even know what size drill bit this is. Very, very small hole, and then used this to just literally vacuum the air out. So I pulled the air pocket out. The epoxy came through as well, so that hole is now filled. So I just put a little bit of tape over it just to make sure it doesn't try to vacuum any air back in. And once they're dry and cured, we'll just sand it down and it should be fine. All right, so it is still curing, but you can see there, nice and uniform, no air bubbles. We're gonna let everything just drift to the top, and that'll be nice and sealed now. So on to the next one. And any sort of epoxy residue that we have on there, it just sands right off. We just use 3000 then 5000 and polish it. So we were gonna do that anyways, just to make sure before we seal them up, they're like 100%. Bailey did an awesome job with the vapor polish and hand polishing them, but just from handling them and doing this stuff, we're just gonna give them one more quick polish before we toss them together. So on to the other side, that's the last of the hex, so all 4 will be done after today. And then from there, we're gonna go ahead and put them in the headlight. So we'll go do the last one right now, and then after that, I'll show you guys what the next steps are. Now we're going to talk about what's next, now that the hexes are done. So we mounted our projectors, and we also mounted the demonized, got the etchings in there. So the next part is going to be attaching the hexagons as well as the shrouds to this backing plate. So before we filled them with epoxy, I did mark where the holes were. So there's 3 holes for the wires, 2 holes for the hardware on each of them. 1, 2, 3, 2 hardware. So I'm going to go ahead and drill those, test with the hexes. Once they're test fit, I'm going to go ahead and repaint this, the final paint. And then the 3D printed shrouds that we have are already painted. These are press fit, so these fit really nicely in the hex. And then once the hex is applied to there, these don't come forward anymore. They're kind of stuck. So after that, they should be pretty close to being done. The last part after this is going to be just making sure that the front housings fit over. So we did already trim those a little bit. I just want to get everything mounted, put the housing, the faceplate up, make sure that that fits. If it does, we're good to go and we can put this together. So stay tuned. We'll see then. I just jerked my head a lot.